In June 1967, Israel defeated their Arab neighbours in the Six-Day War and took the West Bank from Jordan, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt. The UN tried to negotiate the implementation of the peace resolution which ended the Six-Day War, but the jarring missions failed. So the small-scale fighting continued in the War of Attrition until 1970, just before President Nasser of Egypt died. Nasser was replaced with Anwar Sadat, who broke away from Nasser's old policies. For instance, in 1972 he expelled thousands of troops and advisors from the Soviet Union, their chief weapon supplier. Meanwhile, in Syria there was another coup, which saw al-Assad seize full power. Assad and Sadat quickly began to plan a war with Israel to reclaim their lost territory, legitimize their power, force the Cold War nations to put pressure on Israel, and curb the growing Saudi Islamist influence in the region. But they had lost the support of King Hussein of Jordan, who had just drove the autonomous PLO out of his nation in 1971. So, along with Gaddafi's Libya, they formed the Federation of Arab Republics and prepared for war. Throughout 1973, the two nations performed a series of training exercises along the border with Israel, but kept retreating, thus ensuring that Israel would not be alerted when they planned to strike. Israel had maintained the most powerful army in the region, so they also believed that Egypt and Syria were incapable of fighting a war, especially because they had limited support from the USSR and Arab states like Jordan. However, Israel's relationship with France and the UK had deteriorated, and the US warned them against launching a preemptive strike. Plus, they had largely been focused on crushing the PLO, notably after their athletes were killed at the Munich Olympics. So even though King Hussein warned the Israelis in September about the plans for war, they did nothing to prepare. Syria and Egypt finally attacked on the 6th of October on Yom Kippur, a religious holiday of fasting and prayer. The Syrians invaded the Golan Heights with about 30,000 men and 800 tanks, mainly advancing south, while paratroopers captured Mount Hermon. In the Sinai, the Egyptians used artillery and water cannons to break through the defensive Bar-Lev line, and in a day, 800 tanks and 100,000 men crossed the Suez Canal. Despite being caught off guard, the Israelis did achieve some victories within these first 2 days. They defeated the Syrian navy, and the outnumbered forces in the north of the Golan Heights managed to hold off the Syrian advance at the Valley of Tears for a few days. The Israelis tried to counter in the Sinai on the 8th, but the Egyptians, who did not advance as expected, were still protected by artillery, so this ended in failure. However, Egypt's defensive position allowed the Israelis to focus on Syria. Israeli planes flew over neighbouring countries, rendering Syrian anti-aircraft useless, plus with their reservists now mobilised they could form a proper defensive line, and by the 9th they started pushing the Syrians back. They continued to advance for the next few days and crossed into Syrian territory. The Egyptians tried to alleviate the pressure on Syria by attacking on the 14th, but without the cover of their artillery they were soundly defeated. So, just 40 kilometers from Damascus, the Israelis established a front in Syria and focused on the Egyptians once again. Although the Syrians would receive troops from other Arab states, they were unable to break through for the remainder of the war. With thousands of troops now in the Sinai, the Israelis drove the Egyptians across the Suez Canal after costly battles, notably at Chinese Farm, and cut the Egyptian forces in half. Plus, weapons started arriving from the US, which allowed Israel to maintain the momentum. And although their assault on Ismailia in the north ended in failure, they managed to advance quite far south. In response to their advance on the 17th, Arab states declared an oil embargo on Israel's allies, starting an oil crisis. The Egyptians, desperate to stop the advance, fired the first ever Scud missiles at the Israelis, but they had little effect. So on the 22nd, a ceasefire was signed. However, this ceasefire was soon broken, by who is still disputed, and the Israelis continued their advance south, reaching the city of Suez and completely encircling the Egyptian Third Army. With the potential destruction of the Egyptian Third Army, the Soviets stepped in and threatened to send their own troops into Egypt to protect them. And the United States, eager to gain influence in Egypt, pressured Israel to accept peace on October the 25th. In the aftermath of the war, the Israelis were angry that they had been caught off guard and pressured President Golda Meir to step down. But the Egyptians, although they had been pushed back, had their pride restored, and the war helped bring all nations to the negotiating table and start the peace process. The Egyptians would later recognize Israel in exchange for control over the Sinai Peninsula as part of the Camp David Accords in 1978. However, UN troops who were sent to the Syrian border after the war remain there today, and the status of the Palestinian territories remain disputed to say the least.